Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest episode of Tales from Outer Space, taken from the subreddit HFY. The links to all the stories will be down below, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. And if you do, please consider subscribing. Story number 1. Humans are weird. Pacing. Commander Grank, the voice of security officer cracked over the comm, interrupting the Commander Grank's review of the latest inventory. Yes, Captain Growl, he responded, reaching over to scratch the microphone. There has been a manual security alert on the primary corridor, Captain Growl said slowly. Too slowly. Are you at optimal temperature, Captain? Commander Grank demanded, narrowing his nostrils in concern. Perhaps my thoughts are not, Captain Growl replied, but Commander Grank could hear that his security officer shake himself and begin speaking more briskly. The security alert. I have never seen this exact pattern, Captain Growl explained. What is the pattern? The commander asked. 5 diamonds over mesh, the Captain Growl answered, his teeth grinding together in confusion. Commander Grank remained silent, waiting for the rest of the pattern, but Captain Growl remained still. All I can gather from that, Commander Grank replied finally, is that the ranking officer, namely me, needs to deal with this personally. That was my conclusion as well, Captain Growl agreed. Who reported this? Commander Grank asked as he slipped off his couch and pulled up his utility harness over his shoulders. It's a community report, Captain Growl replied. So, who reported it? Commander Grank asked, flicking his nostrils in annoyance. All of them, Captain Growl responded. All of them? Commander Grank repeated. Every member in the base who isn't you, me, or the private stuck in medbay or frostbite, Captain Growl assured him. And what is the location of this disturbance? Commander Grank asked. The main corridor, Captain Growl replied. Commander Grank stopped in front of the door and ran his clenched claws over the scale on his forehead. Where is the main corridor? He asked. It's full length, Captain Grain said. Commander Grank stopped and narrowed his nostrils again. Is the human involved? He asked. Oh, yes, Captain Growl said. The human was the other one who didn't report the event. The scent thickens, Commander Grank muttered as he stalked through the door. He found the disturbance easily enough. He had all but climbed through the geologist who was crouching at the door and led into the main corridor. They were apparently fascinated by the source of a rhythmic thumping sound that was passing up and down the corridor. The source of the sound was the human biologist who had been assigned to the base. He was clutching a data pad in one of his hands, glancing at it occasionally as he fell down the corridor. I think it must have been true that it must have a secondary brain in the lower spinal column to control the bipedal walking, one of the geologists observed. Do you think that the secondary brain took over his physical functions while the main brain was distracted by preparing for a conference? Commander Grank asked as he followed the humans moving with one eye. There's no secondary brain, another of the geologists snaps. It's a myth. Then why would the primary brain be dictating this behavior? The first asked. Commander Grank would have grumbled with irritation and thrust his forequarters out into the corridor. Human! He barked out, pumping extra power into his vocal cords. The human kept walking for several paces before he slowed. His head rotated slowly, and his predatory binocular eyes swept the higher levels of corridor blankly for his disturbance. Human! The commander barked again. The human seemed to focus on the sounds and rotating his body to blink slowly at the commander. They stared at each other for several long moments before the commander spoke. What are you doing, human? He demanded. The human paused, reaching up to sweep the fibrous radiation scales away from his eyes. I'm just preparing for the presentation, he replied. Does this require you to take up the entire main corridor? Commander Grank demanded. The human stared at him for several long moments, his round eyes unfocused and his head bobbed. Yeah, pacing helps me get my thoughts together, the human finally replies. Commander Grank eyed him skeptically. Do you think you could do this pacing during a night cycle? He suggested. You're making the corridor unusable to your fellow scientists. No, the human shook his head. I need to get this done. But I can do it outside, the commander said, where the temperature is currently below freezing point for your blood. Yeah, the human said with a wave of one of his flat hands. I'll put on a coat and a hat and all that. I cannot allow, Commander Grank began. No, it's cool, the human said as he headed for the exit lock. The pacing keeps me warm-blooded and all that. Cheers. Dozens of pointed green noses poked out of the doors and dozens of amber eyes stared at the human as he passed through the inner airlock door. Then they turned in confusion on the commander. Are we going to allow that? The medic asked. How do you propose we stop that? Commander Grank indicated to the sealed door with a flick of his tail. Warm-blooded and all that indeed. End of story. Story number 2. Humans are weird. Surface tension. Written by Betty Adams. Commander Strickert, Zoltek asked and entered the commander's office. The commander was busy over yet another report justifying more equipment and was not in the best of moods. The Central didn't want to supply them 4 times the usual repaired items, then perhaps they should not send item types of oxidize so quickly in a world that was over 90% surface water. He lifted his attention from yet another description of metal rusting out and tried to look attentive at the young anthropologist. Yes, he said. I had an odd conversation with one of the humans. Galactics began uneasily. That describes most interactions with giant bipedal mammals with underdeveloped self-preservation instincts. Stoltek said with a flat tone, Is there a reason you came to me about it? The Galactic shifted uneasily with 6 motile legs and waved a gripper in confirmation. You would mostly likely know whether a human was making a threat or expressing concern, Zertlactic said. It was one of the humans on the space who was expressing concern, Stricklick said with a dismissive wave. They consider us to be cute and adorable. Our eye-to-head ratios are so far into the neonatism triggers that we get the benefit of them instinctively wanting to protect us. Once the horror wears off, that is. Zertlactex looked opposed to enlightenment, but prime cluster of fragmented Sturkta was going to bother expanding on human behavior if he could help it. The young anthropologist finally decided to leave it and went on. I was invited to partake in a human recreational activity, he continued, but the human expressed, or at least I think he was these meaning, that the forces I would be exposed to would cause dismemberment. They asked you if you could regenerate limbs, Sturkett asked as he amused twitched in his upper mandibles. Yes, Zertlatex seemed relieved as Struck recognized the behavior. When actively did they invite you to do? Struktuk asked. Water skiing, Zertlectix replied. Oh yeah, Struktuk said with a wave of confirmation. That one will rip your gripping appendages right off. Zertlectix stared at him in horror as if he was waiting for him to go on. Just tell them you're happy to observe, Struktuk said with a shrug. But if the forces are enough to dismember our much larger surface and volume ratio, Zertlectix began. Struktuk had begun amongst the humans for a long time, and he would freely admit, long enough to be comfortable with interrupting someone else. Human limbs are very firmly attached, he replied, and they rely on the surface tension of the water to slow them down and reduce the tension force. You should go. Zertlectix stared at him silently for a few moments before slipping out of the office door. Struktuk turned back to his report and made a mental note to prepare a medbay for the usual human injuries. End of story number 2. Story number 3. Story number 3. A Nice Swim, written by Hidden Fox. Human Ambassador Daniel Grethen was having a wonderful time. The Kuakanak were great hosts, and Ambassador Zu Lothan was a very amiable person. Zu had personally guided Daniel's tour of the Kuakanak's home world, Uther. They had already seen the larger city, the ancient ruins of an old yet luxurious civilization, and some of the natural wonders of the planet. And the weather had been wonderful and warm, reminding Daniel of his childhood summers. They were currently being given a tour of Gemanthra Center and a very enthusiastic Kuni. The Gemanthra Center was equivalent to an entire city block. It housed the Wutha Grand Museum, a collection and a display of the history, art, science, and biology of Wutha. It was built around a large atrium, which Daniel, Zu, and their assistants, of whom there were 2, and they got along as well as the ambassadors did, and Kuni, who was talking about the pool in the center of the atrium. The pool stretches from one end of the center to another. It actually has 27 bridges spread across it, each symbolic representing the ethnic groups of Kuokanek, and how they all worked to bridge the gaps and the new Wuthian alliance. The pun from the Kuni got a laugh from everyone else. Now if you look at the skylight, you can see some odd objects. Those are actually designed to create shadows in the correct time of day, to create lines to a very famous poem written at the bottom of the pool. When the sun shines in from the west at dawn, it spells out the first line of Dufa Lakmar's famous poem, I dance with the morning sun, so drunk on joy. Daniel could see the writing at the bottom of the pool, but it was noon, so the shadows were gone. And when the sun sets in the east, it says, and celebrate the stars twinkling in the night sky. Now, when it's noon like it is now, a shriek pierced through the air. The worst possible shriek, one that everyone knew. A mother's shriek. It seemed that time stopped as everyone spun towards the scream. At the closest bridge, which arced high above the water, a distraught Entomoon hung over the edge, grasping for a child slowly falling. The child was an Entomoon hatchling. Entomoon evolved on a dry planet with the thick, heavy scales. The hatchling plummeted towards the clear blue pool of water. Daniel didn't know how well the Entomoon could swim, or a hatchling for that matter, but he wouldn't take the chances. He didn't hesitate, in fact, and he didn't even think about it. He just did it. Immediately he launched himself into the headlong sprint towards the water, each step landing with precision, propelling him forward and faster. With a splash and a screech, the hatchling hit the water and began to flail and sink. Reaching the edge of the pool, he jumped into a dive. Breaking the calm water, he saw the quickly sinking shape of the hatchling. Using as much momentum as he had on the dive, he was about a third of the way to the hatchling coming back up. He immediately began kicking, ripping his hands through the water in a freestyle. He pushed himself faster as the hatchling kept sinking. Reaching to the point where the hatchling had fallen, he took a deep breath, and without pausing dived down after it. Kicking and pulling himself down, the hatchling's descent was still ahead. He pushed more, pushing the force of the base instincts and raw, unfiltered need to do the right thing. His lungs burned, his arms were in agony, his legs screamed. He reached out, grasped for the hatchling, and out of some last gamble of tricky act of faith, oh pure dumb luck, so did the hatchling. Grabbing its small hand and putting it towards him, he began to swim up. His body screamed, his arms were going numb from the pain, his legs threatened to detach. His lungs were filled with molten iron, and he kicked harder. He breached the surface, putting the hatchling in the air before himself, taking a raggedy breath as he began to swim towards the shore. His vision tunneled, only to see the hatchling and the distant shore. Nothing else mattered. Nothing else existed. Only now did he notice the hatchling's nice tan coat. To its adorable little face, that shore was growing closer. With one last hurrah, he reached the shore and placed the hatchling on it, and pulled himself out. He lay there staring out at the skylight above him into the nice blue sky for a little, as medics ran over to treat the hatchling, and the crowd parted for the mother as he sat up. He glanced at the Kuni, who threw the soaking hair and wild grin. Sorry, you were saying, yeah. At noon it says, for there is seldom a gift greater than today, but tomorrow is above all. End of story. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you did, please consider subscribing. If you wish to support the author, there is a link to the original story, so pop over there and give him your support. If you wish to support this channel, however, there are a few ways to do so. The best and easiest would be to share this video with other people. as well as liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. All of these things tell the algorithm that this channel is at least vaguely interesting and that may share it with other people. If you wish to support the channel in some other manner, watching my other videos would also help tremendously. Or, if you really like, there is a link down below to leave a tip or to join the Patreon. Any and all support is very much appreciated. And I hope that you all have a good one until the next time, and I'll see you then. Cheers.